My son used his mother's music to advertise the sale of her piano. That was the part I could not forgive. On the Grant Conservatory website, Julian stood beside Lydia's black grand piano while a 12-year-old student played First Light, the piece his mother had written when our first school could barely afford heat. As we enter our next chapter, he said, we are releasing legacy assets that no longer serve our modern educational mission. The auction estimate appeared beside him, $185,000. Then he smiled and called the piano a beautiful artifact from our early history. Families cannot live forever inside museums built for the dead, he said. I watched the video twice. The first time, I listened as a father. The second time, I listened as the man who had spent 4 decades building that school beside the woman Julian was reducing to an outdated marketing period. The sale was already approved. The auction was 3 days away. And although my name still appeared beside Lydia's on the original incorporation papers, I no longer controlled the company. Julian thought he was selling the most valuable thing his mother had left behind. He was wrong. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of the study we had shared. Lydia's metronome still occupied the corner of my desk. I had never wound it after her funeral. I could have moved it, but grief makes strange agreements with ordinary objects. You tell yourself you are preserving a room when what you are really preserving is the last moment before the room became yours alone. My phone rang before I could call him. "Dad," Julian said, brisk and pleasant, as if he were checking whether I had received an invitation. "I assume you saw the announcement. I saw your sales video." There was a short pause. "It is an auction campaign. That piano has significant provenance. We would be irresponsible not to present it properly. You presented your mother's music properly. You presented your mother as clutter." His breath left the receiver in a controlled sigh. Julian had inherited Lydia's ability to remain composed in a difficult room. What he had not inherited was her habit of listening before deciding that the room was wrong. "The company needs liquidity," he said. "The piano occupies nearly a quarter of the heritage room, and no student is permitted to use it. It is insured, climate-controlled, and functionally useless. Put it back in the recital hall. So another child can damage it. Your mother bought it for children. Mom wrote music on it, Dad. That doesn't make it sacred." I looked at the silent metronome. It made the company possible. His voice hardened. "Mom wrote songs. I built them into a business. Your mother built the reason anyone wanted the business, and I am the one keeping it alive. We cannot keep living inside a museum of dead people." The line went quiet after that. I could hear the faint hum of his office ventilation, and, farther away, someone laughing in the corridor. The company was alive around him. He believed that proved he understood what had created it. "Do you remember where she wrote First Light?" I asked. "Of course I do. Then why did you use it in the video?" "Because people recognize it." He answered too quickly to hear himself. I ended the call without arguing further. 40 years earlier, Grant Conservatory had been one rented room above a used bookstore. The stairs leaned slightly toward the street. The radiator knocked like someone trapped inside it, and the landlord stopped pretending to repair the windows after our second month. I tuned pianos in churches and hotel lounges during the mornings, repaired damaged actions in the afternoons, and collected tuition in a cigar box because we could not afford a proper desk. Lydia taught. She taught children whose parents paid at the beginning of every month, children whose parents paid late, and children who arrived with no payment at all. She could tell within 10 minutes whether a student was frightened of mistakes or simply bored by the lesson. For the frightened ones, she wrote smaller exercises. For the bored ones, she made the left hand do something mischievous. She filled cheap staff paper with melodies designed to make a child want to try one more time. Those exercises became the beginning of the Grant method. Though Lydia never called it that, she called them bridges, The piano came from a hotel ballroom scheduled for renovation. Its case was scratched, 3 hammers needed replacing, and one leg had been reinforced with a block of wood that did not match. I spent 6 weeks restoring it after work. Lydia sat beside me most nights, marking student books or testing phrases while I adjusted the action. During our first winter, a pipe froze above the bookstore. The landlord shut off the heat for 9 days while he argued with his insurer. Lydia wore my wool coat over her dress and taught scales with fingerless gloves. We could hear the bookseller downstairs complaining whenever a student played too loudly. One morning, before the first lesson, Lydia sat at that piano and played 8 measures I had never heard. They were simple, but not childish. The melody rose cautiously, retreated, then tried again with more courage. "What is that?" I asked. She looked toward the windows, where the first pale band of morning had appeared between 2 brick buildings. "First light," she said, "for the ones who think they started too late. Children wanted to play it. Parents asked for copies. Teachers asked if they could use it with their own students." Lydia wrote more pieces, then an entire sequence of books. Enrollment grew because children who had quit other lessons stayed with hers. We moved downstairs, then across the street, then into a proper building. By the time we opened our 4th location, Lydia's handwritten bridges had become the curriculum running through every classroom. Julian grew up inside that expansion. He did homework under the piano while Lydia taught evening students. He helped me stack chairs after recitals. At 14, he complained that every child in the city seemed to know him as mother. Lydia laughed and told him that recognition was not ownership. At the time, I thought she was teaching him humility. Years later, when he returned with a business degree and a plan for digital instruction, I was proud of him. Lydia was proud too. Julian understood systems we had built by instinct. He standardized enrollment, negotiated better leases, and created online teacher training that carried our curriculum beyond the cities we could reach ourselves. He did not merely inherit a title. He worked for it. That was why I trusted him after Lydia died. At her memorial, he stood beside the piano and promised that every child entering Grant Conservatory would know who she was. 6 months later, I transferred day-to-day authority to him. I remained a board member and co-founder, but I stopped overruling operational decisions. A son cannot prove he is capable while his father keeps one hand on every door. The first changes seemed reasonable. Julian replaced the logo. Then he redesigned the website. Lydia's photograph moved from the home page to the history section, then from the history section to a digital archive that required 4 clicks to find. The Lydia Grant Scholarship became the Grant Access Award. Her first notes curriculum became Grant Method Foundations. When I questioned the changes, Julian called them brand consolidation. Then Monica Vale joined the company as Chief Brand Officer. Monica was intelligent, disciplined, and exceptionally good at making an old decision sound embarrassing. She never insulted Lydia directly. She described Lydia's image as historically limiting. She called the handwritten covers nostalgia branding. She commissioned photographs of glass classrooms, tablets, and young instructors in identical gray sweaters. Under her direction, the company stopped speaking about a teacher who wrote for individual children and began speaking about scalable educational content. Scholarships were reduced during the same year digital spending tripled. I objected, but gently. Too gently, I can admit now. Every disagreement ended with Julian asking whether I trusted him. I kept saying yes, because I mistook giving him room for giving him wisdom. The piano was the last object in the flagship building that could not be redesigned into anonymity. Lydia's fingerprints were gone, but the shallow crescent where her wedding ring had touched the fallboard remained. Inside the lid, near the hinge, she had once attached a small brass plate. I had not looked at it in years, but I remembered every word. 3 days after the video appeared, I went to see Elise Monroe. Elise had been our attorney since the second expansion and Lydia's closest friend for almost as long. Her office had none of Monica's polished minimalism. Files occupied the shelves in stubborn, labeled rows, and a rubber plant Lydia had given her leaned toward the only window. Elise watched the auction video without interrupting it. "Can I stop the sale?" I asked. She removed her glasses. "Not on the facts I have. Lydia bought that piano. Lydia donated it to the flagship school 27 years ago. The transfer is clear. Grant Conservatory owns it. I am still a founder." And Julian obtained board approval. The minutes described the piano as a non-essential capital asset. Unless the vote violated a restriction I have not seen, the company can sell it. He made the board believe it was furniture. That may be morally dishonest. It does not make the title defective. I stood and walked to the window. Across the street, a delivery driver was guiding a hand truck over a broken section of pavement. He tilted the load, corrected it, and continued. I remember envying the simplicity of a problem that could be solved by shifting weight. If I go to the auction and object, you will create a public dispute without a legal claim. Julian will tell the board you are acting from grief. The buyer will still receive good title, and you may damage the school. That was the choice he had left me. Remain silent and watch him sell it, or protest in a way that made me look unstable while harming the institution Lydia had spent her life protecting. "Then I will not make a scene," I said. Elise studied me. "That is not the same as doing nothing." At the auction, I sat in the back row beneath lights too bright for the room. Julian did not attend. Monica did. She spoke to 2 reporters about honoring the past by funding the future. The piano had been polished until its black surface reflected the bidders as distorted shadows. The auctioneer mentioned Lydia's name once. Bidding began at $90,000 and climbed in clean, efficient increments. A representative bidding by phone won at $185,000. No buyer's name was announced. When the hammer fell, the sound was small. I thought of the mornings Lydia had lifted the lid before sunrise. I thought of Julian sleeping beneath it during late rehearsals, wrapped in my coat. Then I watched 2 handlers close the keyboard cover and attach a numbered tag to the leg. Monica approached me after the room began to empty. "Walter, I hope you understand this was not meant to hurt you. Was first light necessary?" She did not pretend not to understand. It created emotional context for a legacy asset that no longer served the mission. Her expression tightened by a fraction. The market responds to a story. Julian is trying to protect thousands of students and employees. One object cannot be more important than that. "No," I said, "it cannot." She seemed relieved because she heard agreement where I had offered none. That evening, I returned to the old study. I had gone there intending to find the original donation papers, though Elise had already told me what they contained. Perhaps I wanted the page to contradict her. Perhaps I simply needed to touch something Julian had not converted into content. The lower drawer held property files, insurance records, and early board minutes. Behind them was a small steel cabinet built into the wall. Lydia had kept the key on a blue ribbon in her desk. I found it in the same envelope where I had placed it after her death. The cabinet door resisted, then opened with a scrape. Across the top folder, in Lydia's block handwriting, were 2 words, "music rights." Inside were copyright registrations, royalty statements, licensing agreements, and a trust document thicker than I remembered. Beneath them lay the original manuscript of First Notes, its pages crowded with Lydia's corrections. Certain measures had been rewritten 3 or 4 times. Beside one exercise, she had written a student's name and the words, "Give him room to fail without hearing failure." I called Elise. She arrived 40 minutes later and read at my desk while I made coffee neither of us drank. She began with the copyright registrations, moved to the trust agreement, then opened the licensing contract between the trust and Grant Conservatory. On the 3rd reading, she reached for a legal pad. "Walter, when did you last review royalty statements from the company?" Lydia handled them. After she died, Julian's finance department said everything had been consolidated. Consolidated into what? The company accounts, I assumed. Elise looked back at the document. They could not consolidate ownership. She showed me Lydia's signature, then mine. Years before Julian became chief executive, Lydia had transferred the copyrights for 32 compositions into the Lydia Grant Music Trust. The company had received a license to use them in its schools and approved educational materials. It had not received the copyrights themselves. I remembered signing the trust papers. At the time, we were opening 3 locations in 1 year. Lydia was recovering from surgery, and Elise had explained that the arrangement would protect the music and preserve scholarship funding no matter who eventually managed the company. I had understood the purpose. I had forgotten the power of the terms. "Who is the trustee now?" I asked, though I could see the answer. "You are. The school owned the piano." "Yes, but not the music." Elise closed the agreement and met my eyes. Not a single note. The school owned the piano. Lydia still owned every song composed on it. Julian had sold the one object he believed contained his mother's legacy. The documents in front of me proved her real legacy had never belonged to him at all. Elise and I spent the rest of that night learning how carefully Lydia had prepared for a future neither of us had wanted to imagine. The trust agreement was not a weapon aimed at Julian. It had been signed years before he became chief executive, when Lydia and I still expected to run the conservatory together for another decade. It did not name our son, restrict his inheritance, or give me power over daily operations. Its language applied to every future manager equally. Lydia had built 3 protections into it. Every published or recorded use of her work had to credit her as the composer. A defined share of the revenue generated by the catalog had to return to the trust, with part of that money reserved for scholarships. And although Grant Conservatory could use the music in its own classrooms and approved materials, it could not license the catalog to outside companies or foreign partners without the trustees' written approval. Elise placed a finger beside the last provision. "The company has a license," she said. "It does not have the right to turn around and sell licenses of its own. What happens if it violates these terms? The trust gives notice and an opportunity to cure. If the breach continues, the commercial license can be suspended or terminated." The idea of suspending Lydia's music from the school made me straighten in my chair. Students use these pieces every day. That does not mean we begin by closing classrooms. We determine what happened, protect the trust, and design any remedy around the people who did not cause the breach. That was Lydia's intention, too. I could hear it in a sentence she had repeated whenever a publisher offered more money in exchange for broader control. "A song can earn money," she used to say. It should never forget whom that money was meant to help. She had not created the trust because she feared our son. She had created it because she knew love was not an accounting system. A responsible family today could become a careless board tomorrow. A school built by teachers could eventually be run by people who saw only content, margin, and territory. By dawn, anger had given way to a harder question. How much of Lydia's work was Julian already selling as his own? Elise contacted Jonah Price that morning. Jonah was a forensic royalty accountant who had spent 20 years tracing income through publishing companies, online platforms, and education franchises. He did not arrive with dramatic accusations. He arrived with a narrow gray case, 3 sharpened pencils, and the patient expression of a man who expected numbers to lie less convincingly than people. The trust agreement gave the trustee inspection rights over records connected to the licensed catalog. Elise sent a formal request. Grant Conservatory's finance department responded with 4 years of royalty statements and a summary showing that revenue from Lydia's compositions had declined steadily. Julian's company claimed the catalog had generated less than $140,000 during the most recent reporting year, Jonah read the summary once. "Which courses have the highest enrollment?" he asked. I gave him the names of 3 programs. "And what music do those students play?" "Mostly Lydia's." He tapped the revenue total with one pencil. Then, either the company's most popular courses stopped earning money, or someone changed where the money is counted. He asked for tuition allocations, music book sales, application subscriptions, teacher certification fees, franchise agreements, video course receipts, and the investor materials Julian had distributed while raising funds for the digital expansion. The finance department resisted the first request. It called several categories unrelated to royalties. Jonah answered by attaching pages from the company's own course descriptions. Each one promoted the same 32 compositions as the foundation of the grant method. The records came in stages after that. At first, the discrepancy looked technical. Printed books still appeared in the royalty reports, but digital workbooks did not. Direct classroom tuition was partially counted, but subscription income from the same lessons was placed under platform access. Teacher certification programs charged instructors for permission to teach the curriculum, yet those fees were categorized as professional development. Franchise partners paid a curriculum fee, but the accounting system recorded it as brand support. The labels changed. The music did not. For nearly 3 weeks, Jonah built a map across bank receipts, contracts, course catalogs, and internal sales reports. I watched him connect each income stream to the composition students actually received. The more modern Julian made the delivery system, the easier it had become to pretend the underlying work no longer produced the revenue. One afternoon, Jonah turned his laptop toward me. A column of figures ran down the screen, each linked to a supporting record. "The business did not stop earning money from the music," he said. "It stopped reporting the revenue the music produced. Over the reviewed period, more than $2,100,000 in catalog-related revenue had been left outside the royalty reports. The unpaid royalties and required scholarship allocation totaled approximately $318,000, but the missing money was only one part of it. All 32 compositions had been renamed in the digital library as grant method originals. Lydia's name had been removed from the application, the teacher portal, the newest workbooks, and most recorded lessons. In an investor presentation, the entire catalog appeared under a heading describing it as company-owned proprietary educational content. The same presentation showed a map of 18 proposed international markets. Julian was not merely using Lydia's work inside the existing school. He was preparing to soft-license it around the world. I kept returning to one spreadsheet in the scholarship records. Sophie Ramirez, a gifted student at the flagship school, had received support through the Lydia Grant Scholarship before Julian changed its name. Her award had been reduced by half during the same quarter. The company approved a 7-figure increase in spending for the digital expansion. I had met Sophie twice at recitals. She played with great concentration, leaning toward the keyboard as though listening for an answer beneath the notes. Her mother worked nights at a hospital laundry. Without the scholarship, Sophie had cut her private lessons from weekly to twice a month. The money Lydia's trust required for students like Sophie had been redirected while executives told the board the digital program would carry Lydia's educational vision to more families. It was difficult to decide which insult was worse. The company was earning money from Lydia's name while removing it, and taking money from her intended students while claiming to expand her mission. Then Elise found Monica's email. It had been included in a thread about revised workbook covers. A curriculum manager had asked whether the composer credit should remain on the copyright page. Monica's reply was brief. "Lydia Grant makes the program sound historical. Remove the name and make the content feel proprietary." A later message from the same thread said, "Customers did not care who had written exercises 40 years earlier." What mattered, Monica argued, was presenting one unified company-owned method. I read both messages in Elise's office. Could she claim this was a mistake? I asked. She can claim anything, Elise said. This establishes that the removal was discussed and directed. Whether she understood the copyright consequence is a separate question. The distinction mattered. Carelessness could be corrected quietly. A deliberate strategy required more than putting Lydia's name back on a website after being caught. I asked Elise to draft a cure notice, not a lawsuit, not a public accusation. A notice giving Julian 30 days to do what he should have done without being forced. The trust required the company to restore Lydia's credit, provide a complete accounting, pay the outstanding royalties and scholarship allocation, suspend all new sublicensing, and correct any investor disclosure that described the catalog as company-owned. Elise included Jonah's preliminary findings and offered to meet with Grant Conservatory's lawyers to establish a repayment schedule. I added one instruction before she sent it. Make it clear that classroom use continues during the cure period. Elise looked at me over her glasses. You are giving him a clean road back. I am giving the school one. Julian called 2 hours after receiving the notice. This is about the piano, isn't it? He did not sound frightened. He sounded offended that I had found a formal way to continue a family disagreement. This is about the music? You waited until after the auction, then dug up an old trust to punish me. The trust was not hidden. Your company has been reporting royalties to it for years. Nominal royalties. Mom wrote teaching pieces, not a commercial catalog. Your investor presentation calls that catalog proprietary content. The silence lasted just long enough to tell me he had not expected me to see the presentation. Those are standard descriptions, he said. Investors need clarity. They are not interested in the technical history of every exercise. Authorship is not technical history. You're using Mom's name to interfere with my company. It became your company. Her work never became yours. His restraint broke at the edges. Do you understand what you are threatening? We employ hundreds of people. We teach thousands of students. You cannot pull the curriculum because you dislike a rebrand. Read the notice. I have not pulled anything from a classroom. Restore the credits, open the books, stop licensing rights you do not possess, and hand you control. No, hand the trust what the company already agreed to give it. He ended the call by telling me his lawyers would respond. They did. Their letter questioned Jonah's allocation method, described the missing credits as an ongoing modernization issue, and asked for a 60-day extension. It did not agree to stop the international licensing. It did not correct the investor statement. And it did not dispute that Julian had seen the trust agreement. Jonah continued reviewing the records while the 30-day period ran. Near the end of the second week, Elise uncovered a legal memorandum prepared for Julian 18 months earlier. The company's former general counsel had reviewed the planned international expansion and warned that third-party licensing of Lydia's compositions required trustee approval. In the email forwarding that memorandum, Julian had written one sentence to Monica and the current company lawyer. My father will never sue the school bearing my mother's name. I read it standing beside Elise's conference table. Until then, part of me had believed Julian might not have understood the boundary. He was moving quickly, relying on people who praised momentum and treating legal categories as details someone else would manage. That would not excuse the damage, but it might have explained how my son had walked so far into it. The memorandum removed that explanation. He knew approval was required. He had chosen not to seek it because he believed my grief made the trust unenforceable. Elise let me absorb that before sliding another folder toward me. There is something else you should know, she said. The auction buyer contacted me. Why would the buyer contact you? Because she wants to place the piano in the music trust. The winning bidder was Clara Bennett. Clara had been Lydia's first scholarship student. long before our scholarship program had a name. Her father repaired buses for the city. Her mother cleaned offices. Clara had arrived for lessons at 11 years old, with extraordinary hands and no money for a second month. Lydia taught her for 6 years without sending a bill. Clara later became a concert pianist, whose name appeared on programs Lydia once kept in the piano bench. She had purchased the instrument through a representative, so the auction house and Julian would not know who was bidding. We met her in the empty recital room of a small performance foundation she supported. Clara was in her 60s now, with silver at her temples and the upright posture of someone who had spent a lifetime approaching a stage without apology. "I saw the video," she told me. "I heard first light before Julian finished his first sentence. You paid too much for it, probably." A faint smile crossed her face. "Mrs. Grant gave me far more expensive things for free." Clara opened a folder containing the purchase documents and a letter of intent. She wanted to transfer the piano into the Lydia Grant Music Trust after the auction house completed delivery. The trust could place it at the flagship school, under terms preventing any future chief executive from selling it as a company asset. "Mrs. Grant never treated that piano as furniture," Clara said. "She treated it as a door and held it open for children like me." She also agreed to let the instrument return for the conservatory's 40th anniversary celebration. Julian did not know she had bought it, and Clara wanted no announcement before the event. I had failed to stop the sale. Clara had not reversed it or challenged the company's title. She had bought the piano legally and then chosen to protect it in the same structure Lydia had created for her music. For the first time since the auction, I could picture the instrument returning without pretending nothing had happened. But protecting the piano was simpler than protecting the school. I asked Harold Green, the board chairman, to meet privately with Elise and me. Harold had known Lydia since our third location and had no interest in a family feud. He also had a duty to the company that Julian could not dismiss as nostalgia. We did not ask him to remove Julian. Not yet. We showed him the trust, the cure notice, and enough of Jonah's findings to establish the risk. Then we designed a line Julian could not blur. If the cure period expired, the trust would issue a temporary educational license preserving classroom instruction, student recitals, teacher access, and existing scholarship support. We would separate those uses from marketing, franchising, commercial video sales, and new international sub-licensing. Elise worked with Harold on contingency funding, so payroll and ordinary school operations would not become bargaining chips. I would not let Julian place employees and children between himself and accountability. I could not stop Julian from selling what the company owned. I could stop him from selling what it never had. The deadline approached without corrected credits, full payment, or a halt to the expansion agreement. Julian read the copyright notice and told his lawyer I would never act against a school carrying Lydia's name. He was right about one thing. I was not preparing to act against the school. I was preparing to remove the man using it to sell what his mother had never given him. The 30-day cure period expired on a Friday morning, at 9 o'clock. Elise confirmed that Grant Conservatory had restored none of Lydia's credits, paid none of the missing royalties, and made no binding commitment to suspend outside licensing. Julian's lawyers had sent proposals, questions, and requests for more time. What they had not sent was compliance. At 9:30, Monica's office released a promotional video for Grant Global Academy. The announcement described an expansion into 18 international markets through digital curriculum, franchise partnerships, and a global teacher certification system. Every demonstration lesson used Lydia's compositions. First light played beneath images of children in London, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney, while animated lines connected the cities to the Grant Conservatory logo. The proposed deal was worth $7,200,000. Julian had continued negotiating it throughout the cure period. Jonah obtained the final investor presentation from a board packet. The language had become stronger since the draft we first reviewed. Under a section explaining the company's competitive advantage, the catalog was described as company-owned proprietary educational content available for unrestricted global licensing. That statement was not an optimistic interpretation. It was false. The international agreements required Grant Conservatory to warrant that it either owned the catalog or possessed the right to substance it. Without trustee approval, it had neither. If the partners signed based on Julian's certification, the company could face claims from both the trust and the investors who had relied on his representation. Can he close the deal without showing the board the trust? I asked. He can try. The larger question is whether he already told the board there was no restriction. We learned the answer that afternoon. Harold called from his office and asked me to come alone. When I arrived, the curtains were open, though the day outside was gray. The expansion packet lay across his conference table beside the copy of Lydia's trust I had given him. The board approved negotiations based on this summary, he said. One page described the catalog as an existing corporate asset. Another listed all necessary intellectual property approvals as complete. Did Julian disclose the cure notice? I asked. No. Did he show you the license agreement? No. What about the scholarship allocation? Harold's jaw shifted. The finance committee was told scholarship reductions were necessary because donations had declined. No one told us restricted catalog revenue was missing. He had spent most of his career running a regional bank. Harold was not easily startled, and he never raised his voice to prove he understood the seriousness of a document. He simply turned the board summary toward me and placed his hand flat on it. The board authorized the expansion, he said. We did not authorize the company to sell rights it did not possess. I could have asked him to call an immediate vote. The evidence already justified an independent review, and the cure period had ended. But Harold needed to brief the other directors through proper channels, preserve records, and give Julian a formal opportunity to address the discrepancies. Moving too quickly would let Julian reduce the issue to a father, using friendly board members against his son. Harold formed a special review committee excluding Julian and anyone who reported directly to him. Jonah would present the royalty findings. Elise would explain the license. The committee would verify the investor certification immediately before the 40th anniversary event, where Julian planned to announce the final expansion terms. If the evidence was confirmed, the board would be prepared to vote on suspending both Julian and Monica. That evening, Julian called me. His tone had changed since the cure notice. The impatience was gone, replaced by the careful warmth he used with donors who might still increase their contribution. Dad, I want you at the anniversary. I was already invited. I do not mean in the audience. I want you on stage for the expansion announcement. I waited. This is 40 years of the family's work, he continued. The investors know you and Mom founded the school. They should see that the transition from your generation to mine is not a conflict, but it is a conflict. It is a licensing disagreement being inflated by lawyers. We can resolve it privately. The anniversary should be about the future. What would you like me to say? You do not need to say anything complicated. Stand with me. Let people see you support the future. There it was. Julian did not need my consent as trustee if he could create the appearance that consent had already been given as a father. My presence beside him would reassure the board, soften the investors' concern if the notice surfaced, and turn Lydia's transfer of the company into an implied transfer of everything surrounding it. I will be there, I said. Relief entered his voice immediately. Good. Mom would have wanted that. He had learned to use her memory in two directions. When it limited him, she belonged to the past. When it helped him, he knew exactly what she would have wanted. An hour later, his assistant sent me a suggested introduction. It described me as the founder who had entrusted the family curriculum to a new generation. The final sentence said I was proud to see Julian carry our intellectual property into the world. He had not asked me to speak, but he had already written what my presence was supposed to mean. I forwarded the document to Elise. She advised me not to correct it before the event. The wording was not a binding consent, but it showed that Julian intended to use family continuity as a substitute for trustee approval. If he asks you to sign anything at the venue, do not improvise, she said. I will send it to you. And if he introduces you with those words, then he will have stated the false claim in front of the same people who need to hear it corrected. That was the point where the anniversary stopped being merely a celebration Julian wanted me to attend. It became part of the evidence trail he was building for us. After the call, Elise asked whether I had changed my mind about making the correction public. No, I said. He just invited the trust onto the stage. The next morning, I visited the flagship school to review which classes depended on Lydia's catalog. I arrived during the last 10 minutes of Sophie Ramirez's lesson. The studio door was partly open. Sophie sat at a practice piano, working through a passage from First Light. Her teacher stopped her after the same measure 3 times, not because she had struck a wrong note, but because she was rushing the silence between 2 phrases. The rest is part of the music, the teacher said. Lydia had said the same thing to hundreds of students. When the lesson ended, Sophie recognized me from the recital and stood too quickly. Mr. Grant, I'm sorry, I did not know you were listening. Then I heard the version you play when no founder is in the hallway. She looked uncertain until I smiled. Her teacher left us alone for a moment. On the piano was an old copy of Lydia's beginner book, its cover repaired with clear tape. Unlike the new digital edition, that copy still carried Lydia's name. I asked Sophie how her lessons were going. Better now. Ms. Bell lets me use the practice rooms when I cannot schedule a full lesson. Your scholarship should have covered weekly instruction. She lowered her eyes toward the keys. My mother said the school had to spread the money between more students. I understand. I am lucky to be here at all. Children often accept an institution's explanation because they assume adults have told them the truth. What made you choose this piece? I asked. My first teacher played it for me. She said Mrs. Grant wrote it for students who thought they started too late. Did you know Lydia? Sophie shook her head. I did not know Mrs. Grant, but her music is the reason I was allowed into this building. Julian called the catalog intellectual property. Monica called it proprietary content. Sophie understood it more accurately than either of them. It was a door. I told her the scholarship would cover her weekly lessons again. I did not explain the audit or promise money the trust had not yet recovered. Harold and I had already arranged interim support from existing trust reserves, and Elise had documented the payment so Julian could not claim I was using school funds without approval. Sophie touched the edge of the old music book. Does that mean I can play at the anniversary? Were you told you could not? They changed the program when my lessons were reduced. I called Harold from the hallway. By the end of the day, Sophie's performance had been restored. The anniversary program arrived at my house 2 days later. Its cover displayed the new campaign title, Beyond Legacy. Inside were photographs of Julian, Monica, the executive team, and the digital studios. Lydia did not have a biography. Her name did not appear in the company timeline. First Light was listed as a grant method signature composition, with no composer credit. My own paragraph described me as the founder who had transformed a local teaching studio into a national education company. It did not mention that Lydia had written the curriculum responsible for that growth. At the final venue walkthrough, Monica found me reading the program near the stage. I hope you like the presentation, she said. We tried to honor the founders without letting the evening become retrospective. Which founders? Her eyes moved to the booklet in my hand. You and Lydia, of course. My photograph appears 3 times. Her name does not appear once. The event team had limited space. There is half a page about the new typeface. Monica pressed her lips together before recovering. The company needs to feel current. A name does not become outdated because the person who earned it died. No one is denying Lydia's contribution. But Julian is trying to move the institution beyond a founder-dependent identity. Investors need to see a system that can scale, not a memorial. Then why is my face in the investor presentation? She did not answer. I closed the booklet and handed it back to her. You did not remove the founders, I said. You removed the one whose ownership was inconvenient. For the first time, Monica stopped speaking to me as though I were an aging man resisting a redesign. Be careful, Walter. If you disrupt this deal, the market will not separate the trust from the company. You could destroy the value Lydia spent her life building. Value for whom? For every employee whose job depends on Julian succeeding. It was the argument I expected. She and Julian had placed the expansion, payroll, and school operations in one box, so anyone challenging their conduct appeared to threaten all 3. That afternoon, Elise finished the temporary educational license. It allowed every existing Grant Conservatory classroom to keep using Lydia's catalog. Teachers could access the lessons. Students could perform the music. Scheduled recitals would continue. Scholarship recipients would remain funded, with the missing allocation advanced from the Trust's reserve until repayment was resolved. The suspension applied only to new franchise sales, external marketing packages, commercial sublicensing, and the international expansion. Julian could no longer claim that enforcing Lydia's rights required closing the schools. Harold reviewed the license with the special committee. He also secured authority for emergency operating funds if Julian attempted to withhold payroll or blame the trust for ordinary cash obligations. Every protection was ready before any suspension vote. Julian inherited a company built around his mother's music. He mistook management for authorship the night before the anniversary. Clara's transport team delivered Lydia's piano through the loading entrance behind the auditorium. The instrument moved slowly down the corridor on a padded board, while 2 technicians watched the doorways and floor seams. It was covered in a thick black cloth. No company logo appeared on the shipping documents. Clara was now the legal owner, and the signed transfer into the music trust would become effective after the anniversary performance. We placed the piano backstage, where Julian would not see it during rehearsal. When the technicians finished, I removed the cloth and lifted the lid. The polished case no longer looked like the distorted object under the auction lights. It looked like the piano I had repaired in a cold room above a bookstore. Near the inner hinge was Lydia's small brass plate for every child who has not found the first note yet. Julian had slept beneath that piano, practiced on it, and watched his mother teach beside it. Yet he had never noticed those words. Perhaps Lydia had attached the plate after he left for college. Or perhaps he had spent years seeing an instrument without asking what it carried. Clara stood beside me in the dim backstage light. "Are you certain you want to do this in public?" she asked. "He is still your son." He erased her publicly. The record must be corrected in the same room. Correction can become punishment very quickly. That is why the board will decide his position. I will only establish what belongs to the trust. Clara nodded, though her expression told me she understood the cost more clearly than I wanted to. The final evidence arrived the next morning. Before investors would release funds for Grant Global Academy, Julian had to sign a certification confirming that the company owned or controlled all content included in the deal, that no unresolved rights dispute existed, and that every required approval had been obtained. His lawyer had the cure notice. Julian had the old memorandum warning him that trustee consent was required. The special committee had asked him in writing to disclose any limitation on the catalog. He signed the certification anyway, Harold sent me the executed copy 3 hours before the doors opened. There would be no claim that Julian had relied on an old spreadsheet or misunderstood Monica's marketing language. His name now sat beneath the exact representation Lydia's trust proved false. That evening, Julian invited me to celebrate the moment Lydia's music entered 18 new countries. Behind the curtain, her piano was waiting. Beside it sat the trust agreement proving he did not have permission to take her music beyond the stage. The first notes played that evening belonged to Lydia, though her name appeared nowhere in the program. Sophie Ramirez sat at the rented concert grand in the center of the stage. Her shoulders were tense when she placed her hands on the keys, but the tension disappeared after the opening phrase. First light rose through the auditorium, exactly as it had risen through our cold studio 40 years earlier. Cautious at first, then steadier, then certain enough to fill the room. I sat in the front row between Elise and Clara. Harold and the other board members occupied the row behind us. Investors, teachers, franchise partners, parents, and former students filled the rest of the auditorium. When Sophie finished, Julian walked on stage to sustained applause. He thanked her and described First Light as one of the signature compositions of the Grant method. He did not say Lydia's name. He had received the cure notice. He had seen the trust. He knew the special committee was reviewing the ownership claim. Yet, even on the night celebrating 40 years of our school, he chose to present his mother's work as a nameless corporate product. That choice removed the last doubt I had about correcting the record in public. Julian began with photographs of the first rented studio, then moved quickly past them. The screen filled with modern classrooms, application demonstrations, and a map showing 18 international markets. For too long, he said, we have allowed our beginnings to define the limits of what we can become. Grant Global Academy will make our proprietary curriculum available to teachers and students across the world. The $7,200,000 figure appeared behind him. Several investors applauded. Monica stood near the stage stairs, watching their reaction rather than the presentation. Julian described global teacher certification, franchise partnerships, and digital subscriptions. He called the expansion the greatest achievement in the company's history. Then he looked toward me. My father taught me that an institution survives only when one generation trusts the next. Tonight, with our founder beside us, we stop being defined by where we began. He extended his hand toward the stage. Dad, come help me introduce the future. I stood, but I did not walk toward him. Instead, Clara rose beside me. Recognition moved through the room almost immediately. Some of our senior teachers had attended her concerts. Julian's expression brightened because he believed a celebrated former student was about to endorse the expansion. Clara walked to the opposite side of the stage. At Harold's signal, 2 technicians rolled the covered piano from behind the curtain. The room quieted as placed one hand on the black cloth. Before we discuss the future, she said, I would like to return something from the past. She drew the cloth away. Lydia's piano appeared beneath the stage lights. Julian stopped smiling. Clara faced the audience. I bought this piano because the woman who played it once taught me for free. My parents could not afford a second month of lessons. Lydia Grant gave me 6 years. She told them how Lydia had altered exercises when Clara's hands were too small, arranged practice time when her family had no instrument, and found a donated dress for her first recital. Mrs. Grant did not treat this piano as furniture, Clara said. She treated it as a door. Children like me entered through it. Julian moved toward her microphone. Clara, this is a remarkable gesture. I wish we had coordinated it with the program. Your auction video was the coordination, she replied. It told me the door needed a new owner. I walked onto the stage, carrying Lydia's First Notes manuscript and the small engraved nameplate that had once hung outside her studio. Julian's eyes moved from the manuscript to Elise, who had followed me with a folder containing the trust and licensing agreement. "Dad," he said quietly, away from the microphone, "do not do this here. You announce the ownership here." I placed Lydia's nameplate on the piano. Julian was right about the piano, I told the room. Lydia gave it to the flagship school 27 years ago. The company owned it. The board approved the auction, and the company had the legal right to sell it. Some of the tension left Julian's face. For 1 second, he thought I had come to validate him after all. What Lydia did not give the company was everything she wrote on it. I opened First Notes to the handwritten page that became First Light. 32 compositions formed the curriculum that carried Grant Conservatory from one rented room to a national network. Lydia wrote them. Years before our son became chief executive, she placed their copyrights in the Lydia Grant Music Trust. Elise stepped to the microphone. She did not give the audience a lecture on copyright law. She stated the terms as Lydia had written them. The company held a limited license. It had to credit Lydia, report catalog revenue, support scholarships, and obtain trustee approval before licensing the music to third parties. "The 30-day cure period has expired," Elise said. "The required credits were not restored. The accounting was not corrected. No trustee approval was requested or granted for Grant Global Academy. Under the documents currently signed, the international deal cannot proceed with Lydia Grant's catalog." Julian stepped forward. "My father controls the trust. This is personal." Elise looked directly at him. "The trust was created while Mrs. Grant was alive. Its terms have not changed because her son dislikes them." A murmur moved through the investor section. Julian raised one hand toward them. "This is an internal licensing dispute. The company has paid royalties for years. No one is stealing music." Jonah rose from the front row with the audit summary. On the screen, the expansion map disappeared. In its place appeared a simple schedule of reported and unreported revenue. Jonah explained that more than $2,100,000 connected to Lydia's catalog had been excluded from royalty reports. Approximately $318,000 in royalties and scholarship allocation remained unpaid. He identified the missing digital sales, certification fees, franchise curriculum charges, and subscription revenue. "The business did not stop paying for the music," Jonah said. "It stopped reporting the money the music produced." Harold remained standing. The special committee also reviewed advice delivered to the chief executive 18 months ago. He displayed the former general counsel's memorandum warning that international licensing required trustee approval. Beneath it appeared Julian's response stating that his father would never sue a school carrying his mother's name. Julian stared at the screen. That was an informal comment during early planning. "Then let us use the formal record," Harold said. The memorandum disappeared, replaced by the certification Julian had signed that morning. It declared that Grant Conservatory owned or controlled the entire catalog, had obtained every necessary approval, and faced no unresolved rights dispute. One of the investors stood near the center aisle. "Were you aware of the cure notice when you signed that?" she asked. Julian looked toward his company lawyer. The lawyer did not answer for him. "I believed our existing license provided sufficient control," Julian said. Elise opened the original agreement. "Your existing license contains the restriction on the page bearing your mother's signature." The investor sat down without another word. Julian had wanted my presence to reassure the people financing his expansion. Instead, they had heard him acknowledge that he signed despite a restriction his own lawyer had shown him. Monica moved toward the side exit. Harold stood before she reached it. "Please remain," he said. "The board has one more record to address." He read her email aloud. "Lydia Grant makes the program sound historical. Remove the name and make the content feel proprietary." Monica turned back toward the audience. That was branding language. It was not a legal ownership claim. Calling someone else's work proprietary does not make it yours, I said. Her composure finally thinned. No one buys a course because of a dead composer's name. Clara's answer came before mine. I built my life because that dead composer taught me for free. Sophie was still seated near the rented piano. She looked down at her hands while teachers around her stared at Monica. Julian saw the room turning and tried to recover it through the one argument he still believed could justify everything. Mom wrote songs, he said. I turned them into something valuable. Without my digital expansion, this company would still be a regional school living on donations and memories. They were valuable before you learned how to invoice them. I was trying to save the company. You were trying to save your expansion by selling rights you never owned. His voice dropped. You let me sell the piano knowing this. I did not know until after the auction. And when I learned, the answer did not change. The piano belonged to the company. Then this entire performance is revenge because I sold something you wanted. I looked at the instrument, then at the manuscript resting on it. You sold the instrument. You forgot who still owned the music. No one applauded. I was grateful for that. This was not a victory that deserved cheering. My wife's name had been erased. Scholarship money had been withheld, and my son stood beneath the evidence of decisions he had been given 30 days to correct. Harold announced that the anniversary program would pause while the board convened in the adjoining conference room. The directors had already received the special committee's report, Jonah's supporting schedules, the cure notice, and Julian's signed investor certification. Julian and Monica were invited to respond with counsel. The audience remained in the auditorium. Teachers spoke quietly with one another. The international investors left their seats and gathered around their lawyers. Clara sat beside Sophie at the rented piano, but did not play. 43 minutes later, the board returned. Harold stood at the microphone and read the resolutions without embellishment. Grant Global Academy was suspended. All investor disclosures concerning catalog ownership would be corrected. Julian and Monica were placed on administrative suspension pending an independent review. New marketing, franchise, and sub-licensing uses of Lydia's catalog were halted. Then Elise announced the temporary educational license. Every existing class could continue. Teachers would retain access to the curriculum. Student recitals would proceed. Payroll protections were already in place. The Lydia Grant Scholarship would be restored and funded while the company corrected its accounting. Julian could not tell the employees that I had closed their school. He could not tell parents I had taken music from their children. The only future stopped that night was the one he had tried to sell without permission. After the auditorium emptied, Clara signed the transfer placing the piano in the music trust. It would return to the flagship school, but no chief executive would ever again be able to list it as disposable corporate property. Julian left without speaking to me. The independent review took 8 months. It confirmed Jonah's principal findings and determined that Julian had withheld the cure notice and licensing restriction from the board before signing the investor certification. The board removed him permanently as chief executive. Monica resigned during the review and did not return. The original international expansion was cancelled. Several partners later expressed interest in a smaller agreement negotiated directly with the trust, but we refused to discuss it until the company corrected every credit and scholarship obligation. Under a civil settlement, Grant Conservatory repaid the royalties and restored the missing scholarship allocation. The board hired a professional chief executive with no family connection. Lydia's name returned to all 32 compositions, printed books, digital lessons, teacher materials, and investor records. The restored scholarship fund did more than replace a line in the accounts. It returned full lessons to Sophie and 26 other students whose awards had been reduced. The company also adopted a separate annual report for catalog revenue so no future executive could bury royalties inside platform fees or brand support charges. Any external license now required written confirmation from both the trust and an independent board committee. At the first meeting under the new chief executive, Lydia's portrait returned to the flagship lobby. I asked that it not be placed above Julian's old office or turned into another piece of corporate theater. It went beside the student recital photographs, where children and parents passed it on their way to lessons. Some people expected me to occupy Julian's office after the board removed him. I visited it once to collect a framed photograph of Lydia that had been left in a cabinet. Then I gave the new chief executive the key. I did not resume daily control. Replacing my son with myself would have taught the company nothing about responsible governance. 9 months after the anniversary, Julian came to my house. He looked thinner. Without an office, assistants, or a stage schedule around him, he seemed closer to the boy who once slept beneath Lydia's piano. But he did not come to apologize. "You chose Mom's music over your own son," he said. "No. You forced me to choose whether your mother was still allowed to own the work she created." I was keeping the business alive. A company kept alive by erasing the person who created it is only wearing her name. He sat across from me in Lydia's study. His eyes rested on the silent metronome. "Can I ever come back?" he asked. I did not answer with yes or no. You can repay what the settlement requires. You can publicly acknowledge what you did without calling it branding or growth. You can accept that returning to the company, if it ever happens, will not include control. And you can build a relationship with me that does not depend on whether I approve your next business decision. That sounds like no. It sounds like work. He left without promising to do it. I did not chase him down the path. Protecting Lydia's legacy did not repair my family. It only stopped the damage from being renamed Progress. Several weeks later, the flagship school held a small recital in its restored lobby. Lydia's piano stood beneath a new plaque carrying her name and 3 descriptions she had earned: composer, teacher, and co-founder. Below them were the words, "Every child deserves a first note." Clara played the opening passage of First Light. Then she moved aside and Sophie took her place. Sophie no longer rushed the silence between the phrases. I placed the original First Notes manuscript in a glass case beside the piano and listened as the melody filled the building again. Julian believed inheritance meant receiving everything his mother had built. Lydia understood it differently. A legacy does not belong to the child who takes it. It belongs to the person willing to carry it without erasing the hands that made it. If your child sold an object belonging to a late parent and then erased that parent's name from the work still funding the family business, would restoring the credit ever be enough? Or does someone lose the right to inherit a legacy the moment they begin treating it as something to exploit?